Traveller is the science fiction role playing game of high adventure in humanity's far future. Or so the saying goes, something to that effect. Today we're going to be talking about Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition, which is the newest edition in a long lineage of games which use 2d6 and a modifier to try and beat a target number. But there's a heck of a lot more to it than that, and that's why we're going to go in depth with my own impressions and overview video on the system. So, disclaimer moment and full disclosure, I've never played Traveller in a 2d6 system. What? That's right, folks. I cut my teeth on GURPS Traveller, and for the longest time, that was the main bed upon which my knowledge and my feelings about Traveller rested. So there's a continuum of strong realism between the two systems of OG 2d6 Traveller and, the 3d6 world of rolling a lot of dice and playing GURPS. But there's a big gulf of difference as far as the attitude of the two systems. And I'm not going to do a comparison video exactly here, but suffice it to say, this has been an awakening for me about some of the classic memes of how Traveller works and how you can do so much in a session. Because we've been just playing for about 6 sessions of about 2 hours each, which you can watch here on the channel if you want. And in those sessions, we've gone through about 4 or 5 jumps. We are on our 3rd adventure right now, and we've had a couple of rest stops along the way, including that. And to answer your question about how that's possible, one of the ways that it is that there's a great deal of discretion in the Game Master chair about what the scope of a role is and how to frame roles and what sort of things absolutely positively need to have a role. In other words, it shares a lot in common with BX Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of the first wave of role-playing games. Now, we also have only gotten involved in 2 combat-like situations, and we're about to throw bullets in a very real way in an upcoming session. So, why do I feel that I'm ready to have this video up on my channel about my impressions of the system? Well, it's because I think that the system's absolutely hitting the ball out of the park when it comes to the perils of space travel, when it comes to abiding in a universe where space itself, aka the expanse, is a hostile place where you can make your fortune and also get up into a ton of trouble that may require lawyers, guns, and money being sent after you. Now, let's get in a little bit more into the dice mechanic and some of the unique modulations that are in this edition and why I think it's a pretty good. Because this is, I think, the place where it really shines as opposed to some of the earlier versions of 2d6 Traveller. The first thing to say is that Boon and Bane dice, which are something akin to the Advantage in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, are a big part of the game. It's a way for you to throw a modifier or a bonus onto a character's roll in the heat of the moment as the game master based on circumstances. Now, how does this work? Well, a boon is a 3rd die added with the 2d6, and you take the 2 best dice. A bane, similarly, is a 3rd die, and you take the 2 worst dice out of the 3. And the interesting thing about this is that even with a very high chance of success, or when things are looking especially promising, this does not tear away the possibility of disaster. And another thing to keep in mind is that the margin of success and failure really does matter to how these results of tests are resolved. Missing by 5 or more can mean something disastrous. Missing by 1 only can be something like a fail forward result that you may be familiar with from Powered by the Apocalypse, depending upon the game master's discretion. And succeeding by 5 or more is a great boon or just doing things exceptionally well. To round out this landscape of banes, boons, and margins of success and failure, a core component of the test system, how you end up rolling the dice, is that you can take extra time, a kind of an order of magnitude more time to get a +2, and you can hurry a task and do it in less time to get a -2 on the roll. And this kind of leads to an interesting landscape where opportunity costs and the actual real clock ticking forward in the fiction of your session matter a great deal. In other words, it reminds me a lot of old school play. The kind of play where you're moving around in a dungeon and your torches are running out, where the monsters may react, where there may be random encounter rolls. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, old school D&D. Now, of course, Traveller is of course a completely different paradigm, running out of oxygen, how much longer until you involuntarily begin re-entry into an atmosphere. These are questions which Traveller is asking of you as those seconds tick by. Or it could be how long until you hit the jump radius and are able to engage your faster than light, even as missiles are rocketing towards you at 6 Gs. Yes, this is a game that really reminds me a great deal of The Expanse. Now, there are a lot of technological underpinnings to the implied setting of Traveller that make it, a high adventure and a far future sort of setting. One of those is the jump drive, which I've done a video about, which you can check out over here. And the basic premise of Traveler's setting, which makes it into a Wild Westy kind of space situation, or perhaps an East India trading space kind of situation, is that the speed of information is precisely equal to the speed of hyperspace travel. There is no faster than light radio, and all messages have to be carried aboard an actual starship. This leads to a lot of situations where you are the point man in this outer space universe, where your characters aboard their starship are the people who are there for the job, and there may not be anyone else there to save you. And another thing to keep in mind is that space travel is pretty realistic as far as the speeds upon which it is accomplished. It's the normal space travel where you might be out by Jupiter and floating around on an icy moon. If something goes wrong, then other people are going to have to thrust at accelerations of between 1 and 3 gravities towards you, and then turn around and thrust the opposite direction as they approach to decelerate. And that whole process will take, something like a day, 36 hours or more if they're coming from another planet in the system. And this all leads to a real feeling of adventuring that the system is really supporting. Now, I talked a little bit about how Traveller characters are built upon asking a question of how did you become a rolling stone, a space hobo? How is it that you find yourself unmoored from family attachments and from your homeworld in such a way that you are a space traveler? And that's a important part of this system, which is to say character creation is a huge ingredient of how Traveller functions. Randomness is a part of this. You roll 2d6 for your stats, and you do get to assign them as the rule book instructs you. And that's, a little bit newer school, but what you roll is what you get. And then you start picking a career and you meander and wend down the paths of the character's life, and you make decisions which may turn out for better or for worse. At a certain point, you decide to cut your losses and enter play as a player character. You may be a little bit older and long in the tooth, in which case you may have made some aging rolls. Or you could be younger, but bereft of a great deal of starting money and perhaps bereft of skills as well. And this is a calculus which, you're welcome to enter into as the character. And it's a prompt for storytelling and a prompt for the character's origins and backstory and why they begin play. There's a lot of advice about how to construct a player character party and where the cohesion cometh from in Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition, and that's pretty welcome. Before we move on to some of the more mechanical elements of play, I'd like to note that I did have a critique of the character creation section as far as there's a number of rules and special cases that you have to read the body text for, and you have to read the body text pretty carefully for, and yet all of the life path tables are sort of on their own pages and are not all that intuitive. They're pretty information dense, but you can make mistakes, as we did on the first try when you're using them. So that's it's something which I think could be improved by a future printing or a future edition, or perhaps a starter set. And yes, I know they have a starter set where the rule book is exactly the same. I mean, a way of revising the core rulebook, which I think would be welcome because I think that this is a great addition of the game. Now, last thing before we talk a little bit more about the mechanics and some of the interesting changes to the setting and progressions of some assumptions about the setting, is to say that I have to acknowledge that the game is pretty expensive. The starter set book, the harder cover, is it's well over $50. And when the game first released, coming on the heels of Mongoose Traveller First Edition, which I think was out for perhaps 5 or 6 years, and as Mongoose Traveller 2 doesn't have a system reference document, it's not open source, and so you're moving away from an open source game into a closed source one. These prices are pretty high based on what you get. Now, in exchange, there's a great amount of graphic design and art that sort of upholds this sort of hard science, perilous, adventuresome, and all about the space travel part of Traveller, and all about things like hazardous atmospheres and actually needing to worry about inertia that are often absent from a lot of games which will call themselves science fiction role playing, but are often closer to space fantasy or science fantasy. Rest assured, Mongoose Traveller 2 provides a lot of meat and potatoes on the classic sci-fi. Now, what are the fantastic elements beside that jump drive that I mentioned earlier? Well, psionics are still a big part of this, i.e., the power of the mind. And it's still portrayed as something illicit and that, is largely illegal, or at least something which has to move around under covers in the Third Imperium setting. How much is the Third Imperium setting a part of the core rulebook? Well, my friend has called this as something a lot like third edition D&D. The Greyhawk deities were the baseline. They don't go out of their way to say a whole lot about the Third Imperium setting, but they do work from the assumptions that you are in it. In other words, it's up to you to make up what it is if you're just using these books. Of course, there's a great many resources out there to find out a great deal more about the Third Imperium if you wish to. But the door is open for you to sit down with your group and just the book and really get chugging along without feeling obliged to buy a whole lot of other books. So in spite of that big hefty price tag on the core book, I think compared to a lot of other modern RPGs, there's not a great deal of a need for splat books. And now that's the perfect segue for us to get into the other parts of the rules, specifically the starship rules, which are well developed and really represent a robust way to interact with the problems of your ship. How much cargo can it carry? What are the profit margins around doing some interstellar trade? How much does it cost to repair it? How does it get damaged? And ultimately, what can go wrong aboard? What are the capabilities? What can you scan? And what can you know from the starship sensors? These are things which the game does do a decent job of answering. I do have a couple of gripes about the starship section, one of which is that I think that the scale for movement during combat and the scale for the sensors is a little bit on the tight end. You can slip past a ship pretty easily. So say there was one ship watching like the Earth-Moon system, even up to cruiser size, and it could even have a squadron of starfighters deployed to kind of canvass the area and make sure that perhaps they would be able to intercept or at least detect anyone sneaking on planet. That is not going to be the case. According to the scale that's in the book, it would take something on the order of hundreds or thousands of ships to blockade or even to patrol a single world with the scale that they have set up. And so I think that this comes down to they kind of set it up so that a combat round in the Starship combat system was 1 minute. And so the distances were based on what 1g of acceleration could accomplish in 1 minute. And then they sort of worked everything out from there. I think that a single patrol ship should be able to sniff around a gas giant system and occasionally stumble upon what the pirates are up to out there. And I think that that fits much more with what the setting has been developed as. So I think that that's maybe a little bit of a mismatch. I do think that the way that the weapons work looks pretty good as far as the way that missiles and salvos of missiles and lasers and sandcasters fit into the triad of different weapon systems in Traveller. The classic situation where you need to trade off the thrust that you're using to move away from your opponent, haul for the jump point as fast as possible. You often have to change that thrust into some effort to dodge and to zigzag to avoid missiles and laser fire. And that's another trade-off that's very welcome, and I think, a big part of the calculus. The biggest addition and the interesting part for me about the Starship system is that the reactor has a certain amount of power output. You have an overhead from your basic systems, your life support, your computer, and so on. Your maneuver drive and your weapons are each consuming an amount. And so there's an opportunity for attrition as far as your power output could be declining. And I've found that as a result of different checks during our campaign and as the result of just circumstances in the fiction, I can say that the reactor is not running at full efficiency. And the players have had to make some choices about which systems they're going to have to keep online and where they're going to make some trade-offs. And this is a pretty minor sort of alternate kind of hit points that the ship has. But I find that it really brings out a lot of science fiction tropes that are very welcome. And this is something which, as far as I know, is pretty new in all the editions of Traveller, and it works well, especially in combat and especially in perilous situations, because you have to make choices about what you're going to switch off. It's that Apollo 13 sort of situation, frost coming out of your breath, and the cockpit windows beginning to ice up because you've turned off the air circulator. Well, these are the sorts of things that this edition of the Starship paradigm can bring to the table. And I like that a lot. Now, one thing to talk about when it comes to the dice engine, which we discussed in detail earlier, is that I find that it's not for the faint of heart, as far as you need to have good game master skills when it comes to deciding when a die roll is necessary. The normal skills of, is it important? Is both success and failure interesting? And then also, as you instruct the character about how difficult the role would be, and then also, I find that you need to know something about what success and failure will look like in the fiction. You need to have some idea of how it is that the technology of the future, which is pretty reliable after all, since, you can be a space trucker, and space trucking is, profitable enough that you can do it in a men's tank top and a sweaty pair of shorts and apparently make ends meet, which means that the technology must be pretty reliable. The technology must be easy to use. So, why is it that you need to roll dice? What's coming up that makes it perilous enough and difficult enough? And so you need to know a lot about the genre of harder science fiction, the stuff of The Martian and the stuff of The Expanse, in order to understand how the obstacle is before the character and what could go wrong. An example of this is that on a recent adventure, the patron was asking the characters to jettison some of the cargo that she had placed aboard in the hold. And the idea is that they would seat it in an orbit of the planet that they were approaching, but they were also on a tight timetable and they couldn't cease thrusting. And so into the cargo bay in vac suits, two characters went and detached the cargo from the floor and began manhandling it, much as astronauts did with the Hubble Space Telescope and occasionally with satellites that were brought back to Earth for repair on board the space shuttle. They had to haul this multi-ton object and send it hurtling out of the cargo bay door. So what went wrong when one of those characters failed his athletics roll? Well, I narrated that the two objects hit each other, the two cargo pods kind of began rotating. There was an accidental bit of rotation which was introduced, and they hit each other. They began tumbling like dice, and just as the ship's thrust caught them and they fell out of the artificial gravity field, they tumbled outward, and they got just the least bit of vector, and one of them nicked its way into the drive plume of the ship and was singed and possibly destroyed, at least for all intents and purposes. So the failure needed to have some sort of actual consequence. I needed to understand how the character could fail at something as simple as pressing from his magnetic boots and into a large object. Was he going to get a pulled muscle? Was he going to fall backwards and it was going to also fall towards him and he would be smashed against the wall? Well, those were possibilities depending on what was going on in the fiction. And those possibilities didn't make sense as much as just some sort of consequence to the cargo. So you need to have your head on straight and have a very clear image of what's going on in the world as the game master. And it helps a great deal if you have players that are familiar with the genre of these harder science fiction stories, because then you won't be spending as much time narrating kind of the granular details to make sure that you're at a similar baseline. Now, some of my previous experiences with Traveller really hung up on different players having a different understanding of science fiction and often pulling from space fantasy, from science fantasy, from things like Star Wars and Flash Gordon and Farscape, things that don't have a lot of respect for physics or for the sort of problems and attention to detail with how technology can fail. What does it mean when you take off your helmet when you're in outer space? Why is it that your character can't stop spinning when they've become untethered and floating through the void on an EVA? These are questions which not everyone is familiar with. And I do find that you may run into some difficulty, playing this game because it's just has that assumption of physics matters and technology can fail, but why does it? These are questions which I think are before you, and it's up to you as the game master to answer, how these margins of success and failure come into play. So genre literacy is something which I think really matters, and that I think that uh, the book doesn't do the greatest job of setting up a genre literacy. Now, I do think it supports this harder science fiction paradigm as far as all the equipment lists, as far as how it treats with different subjects, including psionics, which I know is a little bit more fantastic, but it places it within the setting, and I think it has good explanations for mind powers that feel like they fit with the established setting of Traveller. If you're new to Traveller, if you're new to the idea of mind powers in science fiction, it might not sit well with you. Thankfully, it's all optional whether you want to bring that in. But all the equipment, all the illustrations, everything really feels real. It feels like it exists in a universe where physics tends to matter a great deal. Of course, they've got that faster than light drive, and they've got things like inertial compensation and artificial gravity, and there's such a thing as contragravity, so flying cars exist. And that's almost the whole list of different kinds of unobtainium which are in the setting. And that limited list of unobtainium, the idea that you can't get literally everything from your science fiction apple tree, is something which, it may take some getting used to. And I think that's mostly what I'm trying to get at with this particular talk about genre literacy. So, how do characters get hurt? This is one of the great praises that I have for the system. It's not really all that different than earlier 2-6 versions, but it's fun nevertheless. So how is it that it occurs? Well, when you take damage in a normal way, taking a hit points of damage that got past your armor, you reduce one of your ability scores, quite literally. And once one of your ability scores is at 0, then you eat into another one. Once 2 of your ability scores are down to 0, you're unconscious. And after a third, well, that is when you are dead. So first goes endurance, and then you make a choice between strength and dexterity. Interesting thing is that much like 3.x D&D, your ability score refers out an ability score modifier. And so if you have a 12 in an ability, that's a +2 die modifier to different skill rolls. And as that ability might go down from damage, so too will the various skill rolls. And it can be that once you're at endurance 0, which is the first stat to take damage, That means that you're going to be at a significant penalty for anything relating to endurance. As you start eating through your strength or dexterity, you will start getting weaker and weaker. This is a death spiral mechanic, but it also means that you can use points of damage in situations outside of combat to introduce more peril to the characters. And this is where I really like it, is that we've had some characters that have fallen off of scaffolding as the artificial gravity suddenly turned on, and that falling damage mattered a lot afterwards. We had some people who were flung loose from a suddenly accelerating starship. And the sudden acceleration and the being sent off, spinning, very difficult, did some damage, and it reflected in what happened afterwards. So the ability for hit points to not just be invisible until you've reached zero, I think is a really great asset to the way that the storytelling in this game works. And it brings a certain urgency to applying first aid and getting behind cover, getting to a place of safety, returning to the airlock so that you can check your buddy out and get them recuperated. If you're new to Traveller because you're interested in it after seeing The Expanse or something like The Martian, and you would like some sort of higher realism science fiction role playing, then I think that Mongoose Traveller is a great option. Fair warning, this is not a system that has much zero to hero mechanics. It doesn't have much in the way of player character progression besides through wealth. It's the poverty of the characters. It's the fact that they are really kind of maybe running from the bounty hunter or at least the wolf at the door, which keeps play going. The idea that you are reaching for the next level and the next little package of abilities is not something which can keep someone playing. You need to be interested in the fiction and interested in the world, and ultimately, in some respects, at least interested in the character's survival and seeing more of the character's story unfold for you to want to come back some more. So this means that as the game master, these situations that the players are going to go into need to be exciting. They're not just a means to an end to level up. It's not challenge-based play. It's very much about discovering the way that you're on. In a future upload of our campaign, you're going to see an extremely surprising, sudden right turn because a single die roll set things off in a direction that no one was expecting. And, the adventure could have ended right there. In some respects, some people would say that this is the reason that you don't roll for things during the journey. And maybe you even skip to the good part. Well, in Traveller, I think that the mechanics are there to narrate and to understand what happens during the journey, what went wrong, what could go wrong. In Traveller, you have the facility as the game master to invoke rolls in those spaces between the inflection points of a story, where discovery can happen because something unexpected occurs. You have the tools using this very simple system to really get things discovered, to find a story rather than to tell one. And this is how I think that Mongoose Traveller 2nd Edition is very much at home with old school play. And I hope that you take a moment to think about playing it for yourself. Have a look at the actual plays here on the channel. Seth Skorkowski does his own videos about it, which have their own sort of personality, as I have mine. But I encourage you to like and subscribe and do things to both of our videos, whatever you like, because the more the merrier. And I hope that you're having a great gaming winter, soon to be spring, I dearly hope. And happy gaming.